Today I'm just going to cover projections, but I also thought it would be useful to talk about the greenhouse gas inventory, the most recent figures we have. So it's a bit about where we are and through the EPA's work where we see we're going over the coming years out to 2020. So that will include, as I said, the inventory, a bit about the EU emissions trading sector and the emissions from there, and also projections and distance to target with regard to Kyoto Protocol, but also our 2020 figures. First of all, the EPA has been producing greenhouse gas inventories since 1995, so almost 20 years we've been in the business of inventories. However, it was in 2007, under the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol, that we were designated by government as the National Atmospheric Inventory Authority. Also in 2007, in the context of the National Climate Change Strategy, the EPA was assigned or designated responsibility to produce greenhouse gas projections on an annual basis. We submit the figures with regard to inventory to both the EU and the UN on an annual basis, and with regard to projections, we submit those figures biannually to the EU, although we produce the figures annually for information for both policymakers and the public within Ireland. A key thing to say with regard to both the inventories and the projections is that we don't do it alone. We are compiling and pulling together information from a wide range of sources, many of whom are here today. You know, SEAI, for example, are critical in it, CSO, Department of Agriculture and Marine. So really it is pulling together of the expertise of a number of different organisations. So first of all, and Geraldine alluded to it, with regard to our inventories, the most recent figure we have is 2010. And here you'll see that the emissions of greenhouse gases in Ireland peaked in 2001 at just under 70 million tonnes. We then had a very, very small decrease year on year for a number of years up to 2008, just bringing a total decrease of 4% between 2001 and 2008. And then suddenly we see quite a dramatic decrease in the period up to 2010. Primarily, I'd have to say, the result of recession, but quite a dramatic decrease there, you'll see. Most recent inventories, as I said, is 2010, and they've been submitted to both the UN and the EU. But then just looking at the sectoral trends, and hopefully you can all see it there, the very top line, the green line, shows agriculture. And the agriculture emissions actually peaked in 1998 and have been reducing slightly since then. Transport, on the other hand, is the maroon or reddy coloured line, grew dramatically between 1990 and up to 2007, though have decreased approximately 20% between 2007 and 2010. So a rapid growth as the economy was booming, and then quite a rapid decrease since. And again, as Geraldine alluded to, if you look at transport, agriculture and energy, three big sectors with regard to Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, over 70% of our emissions come from those three sectors alone. We have more recent figures for the emissions trading sector. We have the 2011 figures, and I'm sure you'll all be aware with regard to the emissions trading sector, but just in case, covers over 100 of the major industrial and institutional sites in Ireland. It covers power generation, cement manufacture, ceramics, cement or lime plants, etc. Also included, though importantly, are food and drink sector, some of the companies in the food and drink sector, and also, for example, pharmaceuticals, semiconductor industry as well. And we released these figures a couple of weeks ago with regard to the 2011 figures, and you'll see that there's been quite a dramatic drop again between 2010 and 2011 with regard to the emissions from this sector. We had actually thought it had pretty much steadied out when we saw the difference between 2009 and 2010. It was just a 1% increase. Seen again, quite a dramatic decrease here. Reduction is mainly as a result of the cement sector, which was a 12% decrease. There was also a decrease in the power generation sector of 11%. And again, this was slightly offset, interestingly, by an increase of 1% in the food and drink sector, so reflecting the strength of that sector at the moment. I should also say, with regard to the results, particularly with regard to the power generation, it's hard to split recession from also an increase in renewables and a relatively mild winter. So it's a combination of a number of factors, but certainly, as said, a significant drop there. So that's really, I suppose, the state of play with regard to the inventory. What I was asked today to talk about really was with regard to projections and where we're going from here. And in the context of being asked to speak by the IIEA, we also normally release our updated annual projections in April. So we actually released them today. So you have the absolute most up-to-date figures that we have just released today. We do two scenarios, with measures and with additional measures. The with measures are all existing policies and measures in place since the end of 2010. And policies include, for example, VRT, motor tax, 2002, 2005 and 2008 building regulations. So all of the policies and measures already in place and set in legislation. With additional measures includes all of the above, so all of the existing, plus planned policies and measures. And these include, for example, the 2020 targets set out in government policies such as 20% improvement in energy efficiency across all sectors, 40% renewable electricity penetration by 2020, 10% renewable transport, including 10% electric vehicles. So all of that is already incorporated within the with additional measures. So under the worst case scenario, total emissions are projected to increase by 1% between now and 2020. So that's the worst case. And the best case with additional measures is that emissions will actually decrease by 8% between now and 2020, reducing to around the 1993 levels of emissions. Important to state within that, that's working on the assumption that all planned measures happen and they all deliver emission reductions as anticipated. So realistically, I suppose we'd have to say it'll be somewhere between the with measures and with additional measures that we would think that we'll end up. And looking at the implications of that then for Kyoto in the first instance, the projections themselves here you'll see show that we're looking at or indicating that we will be exceeding, or the distance to target is between 4.1 and 5.1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. However, we would, I suppose, firmly say that we're on track to meet our Kyoto commitments, taking the unused allowances from the emissions trading sector, the new entrant reserve, which has been under-allocated or under-assigned, I would say, in the context of the recession. There's been less demand for it, and also taking into account the potential use of credits already purchased by the state. So, taking those into consideration, we are certainly on target to meet our obligations. However, we'd also say that compliance will only be assessed in 2015 following submission of the 2012 inventory to the UN in 2014. So we look as if we're on track. However, that will finally be determined in 2015. Looking at the longer term, the 2020 targets, and as you'll be aware, and again, as Geraldine mentioned, we have a second and completely different set of legally binding targets applying under the EU Commission's Energy and Climate Change package. And under this package, Ireland is required to deliver a 20% reduction on 2005 level of emissions, specifically in the non-emissions trading sector by 2020. We also have to keep within annual limits over the period of 2013 to 2020. So the non-ETS sector is primarily agriculture, transport, residential and waste activities, and exclude the main industrial activities that I already mentioned in the context of the ETS. The main difference here between the Kyoto period and the EU 2020 targets are the exclusion of the emissions trading sector and also the inclusion of annual targets, whereas in the Kyoto it's the combination of the whole period. Within the 2020, it's annual targets that have to be complied with. And with regard to where we're at with regard to those, we've put on the with additional measures or the best case scenario. And under the best case scenario, what we're projecting is that by 2017, we'll be exceeding our annual target. Under the worst case scenario, which isn't here, we'll be exceeding that target in 2015. So between 2015 and 2017, we're looking at exceeding the target. And the projections are showing that we'll be between 4.1 and 7.8 million tonnes over our 2020 target, which is at best 11% reduction on 2005 figures. I appreciate there's lots of different figures here being thrown about, but if you remember that the requirement is a 20% reduction on our 2020 figures, we're talking about hitting an 11% reduction on the 2020 figures. The total exceedance in the period we're identifying is between 2 million and 20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Very important to say here that really the projections are a direct result of the current economic recession and the economic outlook out to 2020, and also assumes, as I mentioned earlier, that all of the government targets will be met in full. So you're talking about the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan, which I know that Brian will be talking about later. We're also talking about the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, reductions in, for example, residential emissions by over 34%. So very ambitious targets are assumed to be met in full with regard to this. So just very briefly then to look at the sectoral shares, and again Geraldine alluded to the fact that Ireland has a very different emissions profile as compared to other countries. And we see here that 75% of the non-ETS emissions by 2020 are expected to come from agriculture and transport, both sectors extremely important to the Irish economy and also important to economic growth. In moving towards 2020, the recession and the impact of the recession on greenhouse gases is offset somewhat by the projected strong growth in the agriculture sector as a result of food harvest and also the removal of the EU milk quota. And agricultural emissions are actually projected to increase by 7% in 2020 on current levels. And in fact, that's an increase of 6% as compared to our projections last year. So we're actually seeing that the agricultural projections are one area where the projections are increasing year on year. The increase mainly attributable to revised projected animal numbers and also fertiliser use data in that sector. So a sector that's looking at growing between now and 2020. With regard to transport emissions, and again Tom will be talking about this later, the emissions are actually projected to be 1.1 million tonnes lower in 2020 as compared with our last year's projections, and a number of reasons for that. First of all, reduced demand for freight transport and high levels of emigration in the car-owning population, resulting in a stabilisation of car ownership. So the impact, again, of the recession we're seeing there. In addition, the ESRI have developed a new approach to the modelling of energy use in the transport sector, which has had an impact. And this shows the constant refining of the projections. It's not a static process. We're continuously looking and seeing better ways of trying to project into the future and the emissions. So overall, the transport sector is projected to decrease by 1% on 2010 levels under the best case scenario. Few assumptions within there, I think, that are important to note. First of all is that we'll hit 10% in biofuels target. We're at 2.4% in 2010, so a significant leap to get up to that 10%, and a significant challenge with regard to that. Another assumption within there is the electric vehicles target, and the assumption is that there'll be 200,000 electric vehicles by 2020. So again, a very significant challenge already within those assumptions. So they're two of the big sectors, and I know they're going to be talked about in more detail throughout the day. So just really, I suppose, in conclusion, on a positive note, we are set to meet our Kyoto commitments. We're also projected to exceed our 2020 commitments between 2015 and 2017. But I suppose the key message from the EPA is that we can't rely on a recession in order to meet our long-term carbon reduction requirements. And again, Geraldine alluded to and discussed the importance of developing a low-carbon economy. We're talking very much about the green economy and also competitiveness. In order to ensure that our future economic growth is sustainable, we need to be more resource efficient, and I suppose what we would be saying is we need to decouple the economic growth from increase in emissions. So hopefully that's given you a scene setter for the rest of the day's discussions. Thank you.